Let's start with the subsection 3 of chapter 4 of India, that is Bharat. Now, subsection 3 talks about Christianity, enlightenment, and coloniality. The author tells us that age of enlightenment was linked to the Protestant Reformation, and hence it also had a very Christian backing, as one of the goals of the age of enlightenment was justifying colonialism and even spreading Christianity as the one true religion. Even the scientific temper that was developed during the age of reason of the age of enlightenment was used to justify the white superiority over other races and prove why white were racially superior than other races and had more knowledge or more skills as opposed to them. Even Immanuel Kant, one of the most important philosopher thinkers during the time of age of enlightenment, in his Towards Perpetual Peace as late as 1795, openly believed in the hierarchy of races, where he believed the white were the most superior ones and they had this moral responsibility to educate, to modernize and rationalize the other civilized nations or the other indigenous societies or the heathen nations. He believed that white were the most superior ones, the Hindu societies were lesser to them, and they could be taught some things, arts, but they could not be taught scientific subjects and modernity and rationality. And he believed the blacks were the lessest, the perhaps that's not the right word, the least developed out of all of the races, and hence he justified all of the civilizing processes that had to be done in this regard. His other works also talked about the same things, and he openly stated that other races were stupid and incapable, and thus it was a white man's burden to educate them and bring them into the modern rational fold. Hence, the enlightened thinkers also helped in the propagation of such ideas and justified colonialism to a large extent, which itself has a Christian backing. The ideas of one God, as these enlightened thinkers propagated, or one universal morality for all the people, it had a Christian character, as secularism itself, as we have established in the previous section, had a Christian character. As opposed to them talking about and discussing about the viewpoints of the indigenous societies, they continuously spread their own ideas of one God, one universal morality, and hence even these enlightened thinkers during the age of enlightenment helped in the spread of coloniality and justified colonialism to a large extent. Even critics amongst these enlightened thinkers who criticized the inhuman treatment being meted out to the indigenous societies by the colonizing nations, they never objected to colonization in the first place because they thought it's their moral responsibility and burden to do so. Furthermore, they never took into account the indigenous views by while writing their ideas of one universal morality, secularism, capitalism, free thinking, and so on and so forth. They completely disregarded the indigenous views and only propagated their own ideas which they felt were necessary, which was the colonizers' ideas or the ideas of colonization and Christianity and the secular character. Now, according to them, the idea of a nation state was the way forward. And this idea of a nation state was based on certain common links, such as, let's say, a common religion or a common language. But Bharat was very different because in Bharat, despite so many diversities, oneness was a lived reality rather than the forced idea of a nation state. Hence, Bharat or India came in direct conflict with the ideas being propagated by these colonizing nations and their idea of a nation state. Now, when we move to subsection 4, which is coloniality, modernity, and enlightened constitutionalism, the new true religion of former colonies, the author tells us that because of this forced idea of a nation state, the nationalism also that these erstwhile colonies or the indigenous societies now focused on was of a territorial kind. It was not of a culture and civilizational kind which they were constantly deprived of during the colonization processes. They only wanted to organize themselves into the lines of the colonizing societies. Their culture and civilizational deprivation they did not care about. This was the extent of the coloniality that had perpetrated in their ideologies. Even the ideas that were used by the colonizers to colonize them, These same ideas were put in constitution directly, such as secularism, liberty, separation of power, and so on and so forth. Even institutions like judiciary used transformative constitutional to impose westernization with their totalizing power instead of the society's indigenous cultural movings to inform law and policy. What this basically means is that they use westernization and secularism to completely destroy the indigenous society's way of process and thinking. If they had a different religious tone or a different way of life which they used to live with nature, the judiciary helped in destroying their traditions and their culture in the name of westernization, in the name of secularism, because that was the extent of colonization and the coloniality that had been imposed in the mind of these individuals which were working in judiciary. Now indigenous theological systems, their way of life, or onto epistemological theological systems as the author puts it, they now had to conform to the colonial definitions of religion. And even judiciary, as we have established earlier, purported these ideas. And even though their theological systems, way of life, had developed over several millennia, they now had to justify themselves according to the colonial ideas, according to the colonial definition of religion, as opposed to their own subjective experiences, as opposed to their own life and their own theological system. And what is surprising is that it didn't matter if you were a majority or a minority. You had to conform these to these ideas regardless. For example, even though Native Americans were given constitutional protection, their way of life, their lands were taken in the name of development projects, in the name of construction of roads and other such things in America, where they were a minority. But even in majority country like Bharat, the practices and the ways of life of the indigenous societies of Bharat, the indigenous people of Bharat, or the Hindus, had to again and again subscribe to the Western religion framework. And they were constantly taken to the courts, and even the courts affirmed these ideas to prove that their religion had a Western religious character. Even the term religion, which was never used for Hinduism, had to be now used to justify their lived experiences, their ways of life, their theological systems, which was not the case before that. Now they had to subscribe to these ideas, to these particular thought processes as opposed to their own. These people who tried to actively resist the Western colonization and their way of life and continued to practice internally, even they had to constantly be thrown open to the Western processes in the name of tourism, in the name of development. And thus their way of life, their sacred places, their places of worship, their temples, their lands, all of them were slowly being taken away from them in the name of the Western definitions or the colonial definitions of religion. Now, what is very important for us to understand that even in the present day and age, this deep-seated coloniality leads to judgment on the anvils of the European Western modern lens. The free societies which were earlier colonies, even they now, in the present day and age, after so many years of getting their freedom, judge themselves on the anvils of the European Western modern lens. They try to prove that they are more Western, they are more modern, they are more rational, as opposed to them now saying, as they are finally free, that we do not wish to be you and we are comfortable in our own skin and our own subjectivity. With that, the author concludes with the fourth chapter. We will start with the fifth chapter soon.